About 5 years ago, my life took a drastic turn when I finally got out of a very serious relationship. I had been with this girl for almost a decade. We had started dating back in our high school days, stayed together all through college, and even continued our relationship well into our adult lives. I feel like high school sweethearts rarely ever work out in the end, and we were unfortunately no exception to that rule. For the first time in a very long time, I found myself completely single, and I was going to try my hand at dating again. The problem was, I had absolutely no idea how to even date as an adult. So I did what a lot of people in my position do, and I downloaded a few different dating apps on my phone. I went on a few dates with a couple of different women, but honestly, they went absolutely nowhere. The conversations were dry, the connections just were not there, and I was starting to feel a bit discouraged. But all of that changed the moment I met JoJo. Her real name was Josefina, but she absolutely hated it, so from the very beginning she told me to just call her JoJo. We started talking and decided to take things very slow, because we had both just gotten out of long-term relationships. Not long into our brand new relationship, though, she started asking me to sleep over at her place. At first, I turned down her invitations. I liked taking things slow, and sleeping over at someone's house felt like a massive step for me at that stage. But she kept asking me, almost every single day, if I would please come over and sleep there. She even went so far as to tell me that I could take the living room couch if I felt uncomfortable sleeping in her bed. I finally decided to ask her why she wanted me to stay over so badly. When I asked, she got completely quiet and almost looked embarrassed. She said she did not want to tell me the actual reason, but it would truly mean the world to her if I just stayed. I told her I would agree to stay, only if she told me the real reason, and I promised her I would not judge her for it. That was a promise I was about to break in about 2 minutes. She sighed, looked down, and went on to tell me that for the last few weeks she had not been able to sleep well at all. She told me she would wake up in the dead middle of the night and swear she could see someone standing in the far corner of her bedroom. She said she originally thought it was just shadows. Darkness has a very strange way of playing tricks on your eyes, especially when you are tired. But when she would wake up in the morning, that corner where she saw the shadow was completely empty, and there was nothing around the bedroom that could possibly make a person-shaped shadow. Over the few weeks that followed, she said she had become even more scared. She said she reached a point where she could not even get out of bed because she was so paralyzed with fear. One night she decided to sleep on the living room couch instead, but when she woke up in the middle of the night, the shadow figure was standing right in the doorway. She was completely convinced she was going crazy. The night before she told me all of this, she said she actually threw a stuffed animal at the shadow to prove to herself that she was just seeing things. But instead of the stuffed animal just hitting the wall behind the shadow, it hit the shadow itself, and the dark figure moved slightly. Part of me felt incredibly bad for her. She was practically in tears when she was telling me all of this. But I was not lying when I said I was about to break my promise of not judging her. I have this really bad habit of turning things into jokes during serious moments to cope with my own awkward emotions. And in this particular situation, my attempt at humor failed miserably. I smiled at her and told her that it had to be the monster under her bed. JoJo got even more upset by that comment. She told me that this was exactly why she did not want to tell me in the first place, because she knew I would think she was crazy. I quickly tried to do some damage control. I told her I did not think she was crazy, and that there had to be some kind of completely rational explanation for what she was experiencing. I suggested that maybe it was some type of sleep paralysis. I remembered hearing stories about people experiencing sleep paralysis and seeing terrifying shadow entities in their rooms, but she was absolutely convinced that it was not that. I then suggested she try sleeping with the lights on. My logic was that if the lights were super bright, then no shadow monsters could possibly form. But she looked at me and told me she had already tried that. She said that instead of seeing a shadow in the corner of her bedroom, the closet door slowly cracked open on its own, and the shadow was standing inside the closet. I hate to say this and sound like an insensitive jerk, but at that moment I was really starting to think JoJo was a little bit crazy. It was not that I did not believe she was seeing something. It was just that I did not believe she was actually seeing a shadow monster or a paranormal entity. In my opinion, there is always a perfectly logical explanation for the seemingly unexplainable. In an effort to make up for my insensitive joke about the monster under her bed, I agreed to stay over at her place that night. By the time it was 8 o'clock that evening, we were sitting on her couch watching a movie, and she was already falling fast asleep. She was completely exhausted from not being able to sleep well for the last few weeks. I remember having a fleeting thought that maybe JoJo was just hallucinating all of this from a severe lack of sleep. I decided not to wake her up because she looked so incredibly comfortable. She was dead asleep, fully extended on the couch, and I was sitting upright next to her head, gently playing with her hair. A few hours passed by, and I finally started getting really tired myself. I turned the television off and tried to get as comfortable as I could while remaining in my upright position on the couch. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I do not recall the exact time, but at some point during the night, JoJo woke me up. She was shaking me, and she looked absolutely terrified. She whispered for me to look over at the doorway on the far side of the room. I squinted my eyes in the darkness, and I had to admit, even though it was nearly pitch black in the apartment, I did see a very strange shadow in the doorway that did not make a lot of sense. I tried to get up to go investigate it, but JoJo immediately grabbed my arm with a tight grip and begged me to stay exactly where I was. I started to shout at the shadow, and honestly, I felt completely ridiculous. It literally felt like I was just standing there yelling at the dark. JoJo was crying now, and she whispered that because I could also see the shadow, it had to be some kind of supernatural entity. She said that a part of her had been desperately hoping she was just crazy and seeing things. I told her it was definitely not an entity, and if she would just let me get up and investigate, I could prove to her that it was nothing. But she still held me down, refusing to let go of my arm. I asked her what usually happens next, and she said nothing. It just stands there and stares at her. I was being incredibly ignorant at the time, because this whole situation just seemed completely ridiculous to me. If whatever this thing was real, and it did not move or attack, then why should we care? I decided I was going to pick up one of the throw pillows on the couch next to me and throw it directly at the shadow in the doorway. My logic was very simple. If it was truly just a shadow caused by the light, the pillow would go right through it and hit the floor. But just as I was about to throw the pillow, JoJo stopped me. She reminded me that she had already thrown something at it before, and the shadow had moved. She did not want it to move again. I told her I needed to see it for myself. I grabbed the pillow and threw it as hard as I could right at the doorway, expecting to see it sail straight through the shadowy frame. Instead, I heard a solid thud, and I watched the pillow hit something solid and fall directly to the ground. Then, whatever shadow was standing in the doorway slowly backed up and disappeared into the dark room behind the doorway. I sat up quickly, and for the first time, I was on extremely high alert. My heart was pounding, and I could not explain what I had just witnessed. JoJo was hysterical on the couch, crying and screaming that something was not right. Even though she continued to try and hold me down, I broke free, got up, and made my way toward the doorway. She was screaming at the top of her lungs for me to come back to the couch. When I reached the doorway, I did not enter the room right away because I suddenly heard something. It was a very faint, raspy whisper coming from the dark room. I strained my ears to hear what it was saying, but I could not make out any actual words, just that it was definitely the unmistakable sound of a human whispering. As I tried to take a step into the dark room, the door suddenly slammed violently in my face, causing me to lose my balance and fall backward onto the floor. I heard JoJo scream in terror behind me. I quickly got back up and tried to open the door, but it was locked. I could hear the loud sounds of things being violently moved and breaking on the other side of the door. It literally sounded like a whirlwind was set loose inside that room. And then suddenly, everything went completely quiet. I backed away from the door, ran to the living room, and turned on the main lights. I went over to my bag, which was sitting next to the couch, and grabbed my keys. I had one of those small lock-picking tools on my keychain that I had bought online. I ran back to the door, and after a few tense seconds, I successfully picked the lock and pushed the door open. I turned on the light, and the room was a complete disaster. JoJo used this room as her home office. It had a desk, a computer, a bookcase, and a bunch of books and paperwork. The furniture was overturned, and all of the books and papers were scattered absolutely everywhere. It truly looked like a tornado had gone off in there. But there were two things I noticed right away. First, the window in the room was wide open, and the screen had been completely removed. And second, and most importantly, there was no shadowy figure anywhere to be seen. I could hear JoJo yelling from the couch, asking if I was okay. I walked back out and told her everything was okay, but that the room was a mess. I suggested calling the police immediately, but she claimed that the police would not be able to do anything. She was still convinced that it was some kind of paranormal entity. I was not sure what to think. I was incredibly freaked out in the moment, but now that whatever it was gone, I had calmed down and was trying to find a rational explanation. I did not call the police, and instead, I helped JoJo clean up the mess in her office. She stayed at my apartment for a few nights after that eventful sleepover. When we finally went back to her place, I agreed to stay over again, and we did not see any shadow figure. When she finally stayed home alone for the first time after that, she said she slept through the night without any encounters. It has been 5 years now, and I am actually engaged to JoJo. To this day, we still clash heads with each other over what happened that night. She is still convinced that it was a supernatural entity, and I am still absolutely convinced that it was not. The one thing we do completely agree on is that whatever it was definitely there. I witnessed it with my own eyes and heard it with my own ears. I often think to myself, what would actually be scarier, if a shadow monster was living in her apartment, or if a real person had been secretly living in her home watching her sleep every night? Either way, I am just happy it never happened again, at least not yet. When I was in high school, I was not exactly what you would call a popular kid. I was not bullied or anything like that. I just was not the kid who got invited to every single party on the weekends, and honestly, that was totally okay with me. My parents were incredibly strict. They were so strict that it reached a level of constant annoyance for me. I was rarely allowed to do anything outside of the house, so not being invited to parties and other social gatherings actually worked out in my favor because I did not have to constantly explain to people why I could not go. All through my high school years, I basically had just one close friend, and his name was Evan. His parents were actually even more strict than mine were. Whenever I was actually allowed to do anything, it was only if I was doing it with Evan. One weekend during our senior year of high school, my parents had to go out of town. Even though I was 18 years old at the time, my parents still did not want me to stay home alone. It seemed completely ridiculous to me, but every family has a different parenting style, I guess. I begged them for weeks leading up to their trip to please let me stay at home by myself. I told them that I would invite Evan over to sleepover so that I would not technically be alone, and I promised them that we would just stay inside and play video games the entire weekend. I realized that for a lot of people, this would be the perfect setup to throw the classic cliché high school house party, but that was genuinely not our style. I was 100% serious about my plan to just stay in and play PlayStation all weekend long. My parents finally agreed, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt a minor shred of actual independence. But this is exactly where my story is about to take a very dark turn. The weekend finally arrived, and my parents drove off. Evan came over to my house on Friday afternoon, exactly as we had planned. That Friday night, we ordered a huge batch of pizza and wings and started playing Kingdom Hearts 2. It was a very nostalgic game for both of us, and we were having a great time. I do not recall the exact time, but it was incredibly late into the night when suddenly the front doorbell rang. The sound absolutely terrified both of us. When you are not expecting the doorbell to ring, especially in the dead of night, it will jumpstart your adrenaline. We did not answer it right away. We just sat there on the couch, staring at each other. Evan whispered that it might have just been a mistake or some kids playing a prank, and suggested we should probably just ignore it. But a few seconds later, the doorbell rang again. Evan tried to hold me back, but I told him I needed to answer it in case something bad had happened to my parents on the road. I walked slowly toward the front door. During my incredibly slow crawl to the door, the bell rang for a third time. After 3 consecutive rings, I knew this was not a mistake. Somebody was definitely standing out there. My heart was racing as I reached the door. I opened the heavy wooden front door, knowing that the metal screen door on the outside was still locked. Once I opened the main door completely, I was shocked to find absolutely nobody standing on the porch. I looked out through the screen window, and from my vantage point, I did not see anyone walking down the street or running off the property. I heard Evan shout from the living room, asking who was at the door, but I did not answer him right away. I thought about going outside onto the front lawn and looking around, but my naturally scared nature got the better of me. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to the living room. I told Evan that it must have been a mistake and that nobody was out there. Obviously, we were both incredibly on edge for the rest of the night. That might make us sound like cowards, but if it happened to you in a quiet neighborhood late at night, I bet you would feel a little off too. Neither one of us got a good night of sleep. We both drifted in and out of sleep, and every little noise inside and outside of the house made us jump. Morning finally came, and we decided to spend some time outside. We sat on the front porch and talked for hours, enjoying the warm weather. Eventually, as the day went on, I completely forgot all about the weird doorbell incident from the night before. That Saturday night, we heated up our leftover pizza and continued playing our video games. At exactly 1:13 in the morning, my doorbell rang again. This time, I immediately looked at the clock. This was no longer a coincidence. I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me, but I still got up and approached the front door. The doorbell rang once more just as I forcibly opened the main wooden door. This time, standing behind the locked screen door was an elderly woman. She was a very short woman with bright white hair, heavily wrinkled skin, and she was wearing a long, heavy winter coat, even though it was almost 70 degrees outside that night. She also had one of those vintage scarves tied around her hair. I had never really thought of an old woman as being unsettling, but seeing her standing on my doorstep at that hour of the night made me think twice about that. Neither one of us said a word for several tense seconds. She just stood there with a very wide, strange smile on her face. Finally, she spoke. She asked me if Mr. Walker was home. I paused for a second, still trying to process the sheer bizarreness of the situation. Then I told her that nobody by that name lived here. Her wide smile slowly faded from her face. She made a soft, sympathetic noise, and then she smiled big again. She said, "Oh yes, that is right, Mr. Walker does not live here anymore." I forced a polite smile and told her to have a good night. But before I could close the door all the way, she spoke up again. She asked me if Joe was still around. I told her she definitely had the wrong house, and that I would really appreciate it if she would leave my property. Suddenly, she started to laugh. It was a high-pitched, mocking laugh. She said that Joe was still inside the house. When I asked her what she meant by that, she just continued laughing and told me that she could hear him inside right now. I told her okay, and I slammed the heavy wooden door shut. As I walked away from the door, I could still hear her laughing loudly on the front porch. Evan was standing in the hallway, looking terrified. He started to ask me what had happened, and I told him to get his phone ready to call the police, just in case this woman, who was clearly insane, refused to leave. A few minutes later, I crept over to the front window and peered out. I saw her standing directly in the middle of the dark street, facing my house. It was hard to see her clearly, but I was pretty sure she was still smiling. We contemplated calling the police right then and there, but as a sheltered teenager, I was terrified of what kind of trouble that might cause with my parents. If this happened to me today, I would call the cops instantly, but back then, I just could not bring myself to do it. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I looked out the window again. She was still standing in the exact same spot in the middle of the street. For almost 2 hours, she had just stood there, staring at my house. I decided right then that I had had enough. I was either going to yell at her through the screen door to go away, or I was calling the cops. As I opened the front door, I did not even have time to shout, because the moment she saw the door open, She started to sprint directly toward my front porch at a shocking speed. This woman was very old, and I have absolutely no idea how she was physically able to move that fast. I cannot even begin to describe how terrifying it is to see someone of that age move with that kind of unnatural speed. Before she could reach the porch, I slammed the front door shut, locked it, and screamed. Evan ran over to see what was happening. Before I could even begin to explain, I looked at Evan, and he was standing there completely frozen like a statue. He was stuttering, but eventually, he managed to get the words out. He told me to look at the window. I looked at the window right next to the front door, and pressed flat against the glass was the face of the old woman, smiling. She was bending her body sideways at an almost unnatural angle, just staring in at us. I grabbed the house phone and dialed 911. For several minutes, she stood in that exact spot, staring through the glass without moving a muscle. A couple of minutes before the police car arrived, she finally backed away and vanished into the dark. When the officer arrived, I could tell he was very skeptical of our story. At the end of the day, we were just two high school kids telling a wild story about an unnaturally fast, athletic elderly woman. I probably would not have believed us either. He took our statements and left. Needless to say, we did not sleep at all that night. I fully expected her to return the moment the police car drove away, but thankfully, she did not come back. My parents came home late Monday morning. I initially planned on not telling them what had happened, but eventually I caved. I did not like lying to them, and calling the police made me feel like I was keeping a massive secret. So, I sat them down and told them everything. I told them about the doorbell on Friday, the old lady on Saturday, and the things she had said. As I told them the story, both of my parents looked physically sick, but it was not for the reason I expected. They did not seem to be concerned about the old woman standing in the street. They were terrified of what she had said when she first arrived. They were terrified that she had asked about Mr. Walker and Joe. I had just assumed those were random names, but as my parents began to speak, I realized the truth was much darker. My parents decided to finally tell me that when they bought our house when I was 5 years old, they got an incredibly cheap deal on it because the previous owner, a man named Joe, had murdered his wife inside the house and then took his own life. I could not believe what I was hearing. I was completely terrified. This woman had stood on our porch and claimed she could hear Joe inside. I tried to calm myself down by rationalizing that she must have known Joe when he lived there. But then, my dad told me there was more. He explained that the reason we had moved out of our very first house when I was 5 years old was because a man who called himself Mr. Walker had started terrorizing our family and stalking our home. He would call our house at all hours of the night, threatening my dad, and he would show up on our doorstep trying to break in. My parents called the police countless times, but they could never catch him. This went on for months. My dad, who used to hunt, eventually bought a rifle and stayed up all night trying to catch Mr. Walker. One night, Mr. Walker successfully broke through the back door, and my dad fired a shot. He did not know if he missed or hit him in the shoulder, but the man ran away and was never seen again. We moved away just a few weeks later, and that traumatic ordeal was the real reason my parents became so overprotective and strict with me my entire life. It took me a long time to process everything they told me. I was angry that they had kept such a dark history from me, but I understood why they did it. Even after all these years, I am still left scratching my head. We still have absolutely no idea who that old woman was, or how she knew about both Joe and Mr. Walker. That night with Evan happened 16 years ago. The woman never came back. I do not live with my parents anymore, but whenever I go back to visit them, I find myself looking out that front window, wondering where she went. Maybe my family was cursed, or maybe it was just a series of terrifying coincidences. I just hope that, whatever dark clouds followed us for all those years have finally drifted away for good. This next story is not your typical scary story. There are no ghosts, no demons, and no creepy stalkers in the dark. Instead, it is the potential confirmation that real monsters do exist in this world, and they can literally live right next door to you, without you ever knowing. For the majority of my life, I never really thought of this story as scary. I just thought of it as a weird, slightly unnerving experience from my childhood. I have told this story to friends for years, and every single time I do, they are completely freaked out by it. It was only recently that I started to think about the story differently, and now, when I look back on it, I find it absolutely horrifying. I do not know exactly how old I was at the time, but I was in the 5th grade, so I was likely around 10 years old. I was a very social kid, and I had a lot of friends both in and out of school. My parents always referred to me as a social butterfly. In the middle of that school year, we got a brand new student in our class. His name was Alfred. Alfred was a very awkward kid, and as we all know, it is incredibly hard to be the new kid in school, especially when you move in halfway through the school year. I remember some of my friends immediately making fun of him because of his name. They started calling him the Butler, because Alfred is the name of Batman's butler in the comic books. Eventually, that nickname got shortened to just the Butt. You can easily imagine how much a bunch of 5th graders loved throwing that name around. Even the girls in our class started calling him that. I felt incredibly bad for him, but honestly, it did not really look like the teasing bothered Alfred all that much. He just accepted the verbal abuse as it came and went about his daily life. I think the main reason I had a soft spot for Alfred was because his family had moved into the house directly next door to mine. Because we lived next to each other, we rode the same school bus and walked home together every single day. I quickly realized during those short walks that Alfred and I actually had a lot in common, specifically things that my other friends did not like at all. For instance, we both absolutely loved professional wrestling. My other friends hated wrestling with a passion. It is just one of those things that you either love or you hate, and there really is not much middle ground. We bonded over our shared love for wrestling for a couple of months, but we never actually hung out outside of school hours. Even in school, our conversations were usually pretty brief. I still sat with my regular group of friends at lunch, and they flat out refused to let Alfred sit at the table with us. Kids can be incredibly ruthless, but Alfred never seemed to hold a grudge. One Friday afternoon, when I got home from school, my mom was on the phone. She was using her classic, friendly mom voice, and when she finally hung up, she told me she had been talking to Alfred's mom. His mom had told her that Alfred was struggling to fit in at school, and that she believed it was because almost everyone was mean to him, except for me. She asked my mom if I would be willing to come over to their house for a sleepover that night. Now, I liked Alfred well enough, but I really did not want to sleep over at his house. I knew my other friends would absolutely destroy me if they ever found out about it. But my mom, being the kind-hearted woman she is, had already told Alfred's mom that I would absolutely love to stay over. I did not bother arguing with her because I knew it was a battle I was guaranteed to lose. I figured I would just go over, talk about wrestling, and make the absolute best of the situation. I walked over to his house in the late afternoon. His parents were actually incredibly nice people. His dad was wearing a vintage wrestling t-shirt and was extremely outgoing. He was doing a bunch of funny wrestler impressions and talking to me about old school matches, and I was honestly having a really great time. As it started to get late, Alfred's parents told us they were heading upstairs to bed. They said we could stay up as late as we wanted, as long as we were not too loud, and under one strict condition, we were absolutely not allowed to go down into the basement. After his parents went upstairs, I asked Alfred why we could not go down there. He told me that his dad kept a lot of dangerous equipment down there for his job, and that it was just best to avoid the basement entirely, so we would not get hurt. I thought that was a bit weird, but I shrugged it off and we went back to our video games. Eventually, we decided to go to sleep. Well, Alfred went to sleep, but I could not sleep at all. I have always had a very hard time sleeping whenever I stay overnight at someone else's house. During the middle of the night, as I lay there in the dark, I heard the sound of Alfred's dad coming back downstairs. I immediately closed my eyes and pretended to be fast asleep. A few seconds later, I heard him walk past the living room and open the door to the basement hallway. He closed the door behind him, and through the heating vent right next to my head, I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps descending the basement stairs. I did not hear anything else for a little while, and I thought it was incredibly strange that his dad would wake up in the dead of night just to go down into the basement. but I did not think too much of it. But then a few minutes later, I started to hear a strange muffled sound coming up through the vents. It sounded a lot like a television, but it was filled with a lot of heavy static. The sound was far too distorted for me to make out any specific words or details. After about an hour, the distorted sound finally stopped, and I heard the basement door open again. His dad came back upstairs, walked into the living room, stood there in silence for a brief moment, and then went back upstairs to his bedroom. I finally fell asleep shortly after that. When I woke up the next morning, Alfred's dad was already in the kitchen making us a huge breakfast. He was the exact same vibrant, goofy guy I had met the previous afternoon. While we were eating our breakfast, he started talking to us about older wrestling events from the 1980s. He mentioned that he actually had a massive collection of old wrestling shows recorded on VHS tapes down in the basement. Alfred immediately perked up and told me that I had to watch some of these matches because they were absolutely legendary. His dad smiled and told me that if it was okay with my parents, I could stay over for a second night, and he would go down to the basement and grab some of those classic tapes for us to watch. I was really excited about the idea, so I called my mom, and she easily agreed to let me stay another night. Alfred's dad told us he had to run some errands for a few hours, but promised that as soon as he got back, we would watch the tapes. I spent the afternoon talking with Alfred about the matches his dad had mentioned. I told Alfred that I had actually heard his dad go down into the basement the night before, and that it sounded like he was watching a television down there. Alfred looked genuinely confused. He said he did not understand why his dad would ever go down into the basement in the middle of the night. In my attempt to clear up his confusion, I foolishly suggested that we should just sneak down into the basement ourselves and check out his dad's legendary wrestling tape collection. Alfred looked incredibly nervous. He reminded me that his dad had strictly forbidden us from going down there, but being the terrible pushy friend that I was, I told him that his dad was gone and would never even know we went down. I promised we would just look at the tapes and run right back upstairs before he got home. Alfred was very reluctant, but he finally agreed. I think he just wanted to please me so that we could keep building our new friendship. We opened the basement door and crept down the stairs. The basement was exactly what you would expect an old basement to look like. It was dark, freezing cold, and completely unfinished. But in the far back corner of the basement, there was this incredibly creepy solid yellow wooden door. Spray painted across the front of the door, in big black letters, were the words, "Get out." When I pointed at the ominous-looking door, Alfred shrugged and said it was like that when they first moved in. He said his dad thought it looked cool, so he decided to leave it. Alfred walked over to the yellow door and told me that this was where his dad kept all of his tapes. He opened the door, and behind it was a small, windowless room. One entire wall was lined with massive shelves filled with thousands of videotapes. On the opposite side of the room, there was a small table with an older television and a VCR player. This was clearly where his dad had been the night before. I started running my fingers along the shelves, looking at the labels on the tapes. Almost every single tape was meticulously labeled with the name of the wrestling event, the venue, and the exact year it took place. But as I kept looking, I noticed a few tapes scattered throughout the collection that had very plain, simple white labels. These labels just had basic handwriting that said things like Wrestling Tape 1 and Wrestling Tape 2. It felt very out of place compared to how detailed all of the other labels were. Out of pure curiosity, I grabbed the tape labeled Wrestling Tape 2 and walked over to the VCR. Alfred asked me what I was doing and begged me to put it back, but I told him I just wanted to see what was on it for a second. I pushed the tape into the VCR and turned on the television screen. Instead of a wrestling match appearing on the screen, the tape started playing a very grainy, static-filled video. The footage showed a room that was entirely painted blood red. The walls, the floor, and the ceiling were all solid red. The only object in the entire room was a single, empty wooden chair sitting in the center. For the first few seconds of the video, absolutely nothing happened. The camera was completely still, but in the background of the audio, you could hear the sound of someone screaming. It was a terrifying, guttural scream of absolute agony. It was the kind of sound that gets trapped in your head and stays with you for decades. Just as I was about to reach out and eject the tape, a man wearing a dark, heavy mask walked directly into the camera's view. He looked straight into the lens, and in an incredibly cheerful, happy voice, he said, "Stay tuned, you are really going to want to see what happens next." He then began to laugh hysterically as the horrific screams in the background grew even louder and more desperate. Alfred immediately reached over, slammed his hand onto the VCR, and ejected the tape. He was shaking, and he told me that his dad's car was pulling into the driveway. We turned off the television, ran up the basement stairs as fast as our legs could carry us, and shut the door behind us. A moment later, his dad walked through the front door, acting completely goofy and cheerful just like he always did. He told us to give him just a few minutes to settle in, and then he would go grab those wrestling tapes for us. His dad walked over and went down into the basement. The moment the basement door shut, a wave of panic washed over me. I suddenly realized that in our rush to get upstairs, I had completely forgotten to eject the tape from the VCR and put it back on the shelf. I was too terrified to say anything to Alfred. About an hour passed, and his dad finally came back upstairs. But he was not smiling anymore. The friendly, goofy persona was completely gone. He looked absolutely furious, and his eyes were cold. He walked straight into the living room, looked directly at me, and told me in a very flat, angry voice that I needed to pack my things and go home immediately. He then turned around and walked away without another word. Alfred tried to ask his dad what was wrong, but the tension in the house was so thick that I just grabbed my backpack and ran out the front door to my house next door. That next Monday, Alfred was not at school. When I got home that afternoon, I decided to walk over to his house to see if he was okay. Alfred opened the front door, and I could tell he had been crying heavily. He looked exhausted. He whispered to me that his family was moving away immediately because his dad had suddenly gotten a new job. I asked him if he was truly okay, and after a very long, uncomfortable silence, he just mumbled that he was fine. Suddenly, his dad appeared in the hallway behind him, staring at me with those same cold, angry eyes. Alfred quickly said he had to go, and he slammed the front door shut in my face. I thought it was incredibly weird that they were moving so abruptly, but I just went back home. The very next day, they were completely gone. The house next door was empty. Our teacher made a brief announcement in class that Alfred had moved away and would not be coming back, and of course, none of the other kids cared. It was many years later when I brought up this bizarre childhood memory to a group of friends while we were hanging out. I told them about the basement, the yellow door, and the terrifying tape of the red room. One of my friends suddenly started freaking out. He asked me if I had ever heard of a red room on the deep web. I told him I had no idea what that was. He explained to me that in the darkest corners of the internet, there are urban legends and rumors of live-streamed red rooms where people pay money to watch unspeakable acts of torture and violence performed on innocent victims. I told my friend that this sleepover happened way before video streaming on the internet was even a thing. My friend looked at me with a very serious expression and suggested that maybe what I had stumbled upon in that basement was an early, physical version of what would eventually become the online red rooms. I tried to dismiss his theory because it just seemed far too disturbing and ridiculous to believe. But as the years have passed, and I have continued to share this story with others, more and more people have agreed with that horrifying theory. A few years ago, a group of us even tried to search for Alfred and his family on social media, but we could find absolutely no trace of any of them. It is as if his entire family vanished off the face of the earth the moment they left that house. To this day, I still do not know for sure if what I saw on that videotape was a real, horrific crime or just some twisted, simulated home movie. But the more I read about the dark realities of this world, the more I fear the worst. As an adult, whenever I let my mind wander back to that freezing cold basement, I start to completely lose sleep. I sincerely hope with all my heart that it was just a fake movie. Because if it was real, and Alfred's dad was actually involved in something that dark and monstrous, then knowing that I lived right next door to him, and that I was that close to a real-life monster, is a terrifying thought that will keep me awake for the rest of my life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.